I'm a 16-year-old guy currently living in Albuquerque, New Mexico. This experience happened about 6 months ago, during an overnight trip to the Lost Peak Mountains, roughly an hour's drive from my place. I won't mention the exact path as I've done enough exploring to know that once people find out about a good trail, an abandoned area, or supposed hauntings, they tend to flock there, often leaving litter and blasting loud music. Anyway, this particular trail was about a 7-mile loop through a canyon. Pretty straightforward for an overnight trip. I'd planned to go with a buddy, but he had to cancel last minute, so I ended up heading out on my own. With my bag packed and car ready, I hit the road, though I left later than planned and had some issues with the rocky forest roads. Because of that, I didn't reach the trailhead until around 5:30 p.m. For those who don't do much camping, starting a 4-mile hike at that hour is generally a bad idea. But I figured that if I moved quickly, I could get at least 2 or 3 miles in before stopping to set up camp. The plan left me hiking a dark trail alone, with about 12 miles of dirt road separating me from the nearest person. Walking in the dark through the woods is unsettling, especially being by yourself. Soon, it got so dark that only my headlamp showed me where to step. I knew I had to stop and set up camp, so I found a less than ideal spot with some burned wood and a faint fire ring, indicating someone had camped there before, though not anytime recently. My first task was getting a fire started. I gathered some dry wood and managed to get a small fire going, set up my tarp, and pulled out a can of chili beans I'd packed. Eager to eat, the campsite was set. My food was heating, and the earlier nervousness I'd felt was fading, though a little uneasiness still lingered. It's part of camping alone in secluded areas. To explain what happened next, you need to know my camp setup. I'd chosen a small clearing ringed with large pine trees with the trail about 25 feet to my left. When you're in the woods with a fire, the flames create a circle of light around you, and everything beyond that circle is pitch black. I was sitting on the ground by my fire, eating when a small rock about the size of a coin suddenly landed in my camp. Staring at the rock, I was sure I was alone on the trail. I shined my light toward where the rock had come from, but the thick pines and bushes limited my view to about 10 feet. For the next 15 minutes, I scanned the tree line staying close to my fire. The fire made me feel safer, though I realized later it wasn't much protection. Eventually, I convinced myself I'd either knocked the rock over somehow or it had fallen from a tree. I finally laid down to sleep, unaware of the fear that lay ahead. Later that night, I woke to the sound of crunching leaves, faint but there. In a sleepy haze, I listened as the sound gradually faded, thinking it was moving away. I reached for the small flashlight I'd placed beside me when I'd fallen asleep but panicked as I couldn't find it. I finally spotted a faint light about 10 feet away in the woods. There was my flashlight lying in a pile of leaves. It's one of those moments you never forget. My flashlight, which I'd left beside me, was now outside my camp in the woods. I quickly pulled on my boots, grabbed my knife, and tried to stay calm. I weighed my options, either wait out the night in my camp or risk the 3-mile hike back to my car in total darkness. I decided it was safer to stay put, assuming whoever was out there would have the advantage. If I went wandering through the forest alone, hours passed, and I soon heard slow, casual footsteps, like someone just strolling. Sometimes the sounds would disappear for an hour or two, only to return again, faint and unsettling. The footsteps came closer and closer until they were about 10 feet from my camp. By then, my fire was barely aglow since I'd run out of firewood. Then everything went silent. I sat frozen, clutching my knife and hoping I wouldn't hear any more sounds. I stayed like that, motionless until dawn broke and the early light revealed I was alone in my camp. As soon as there was enough daylight, I packed my things and headed 3 miles back down the trail. I reached my car and practically ran to it, locking the doors as soon as I climbed inside. I didn't stop driving until I was well out of those woods. When I finally pulled over at a gas station on the edge of town, I mostly wanted to see other people again. I got out and noticed something scrawled in the dust on my car's back window. "Sleep tight." I've had some odd encounters exploring New Mexico, but this was by far the strangest and most unnerving. If you're ever tempted to check out the Lost Peak Mountains, my advice is to think twice and maybe go somewhere else entirely. When I was a teenager, I was camping with family on a small plot of private land in the western hills of Pennsylvania, where my mom's relatives all had their own cabins. The place was isolated and everyone around was somehow related to us. Our summers were spent sitting around the campfire, sharing scary stories and playing in the woods with cousins. The layout of the area was, it's simple. Picture a large T-shape for a road. About 150 feet north of the top of the T flowed a river. Going left along the T would take you past several family cabins, ending where the road met thick forest. To the right, at the end of the T, was my mom's small cabin where we stayed. I often preferred exploring on my own, but this time my aunt asked if she could join me. She was 14 years older than me, tall, nearly 6 feet, and had dye-pink hair with a few tattoos. Definitely not someone who scared easily. She tagged along with me to the left, further into the trees, saying she wanted to smoke a joint without my grandmother noticing. I'd always been a good kid and didn't want to try anything, so I politely declined when she offered me some. From the end of the road, we took a rough dirt trail into the woods, with the river still about 150 feet to our right. Following the slope, we reached an area where, bizarrely, a random staircase stood leading to nowhere. I walked down the path, watching fish in the stream and catching glimpses of crayfish, while my aunt was drifting off in her own little world behind me. I was deep in thought when a sharp clicking noise snapped me back to reality. I looked up, startled, to see a man standing on the opposite side of the river, only about 15 feet away. I had never seen him before, and he didn't look like anyone from around here. He wore a black jacket and rough worn-out jeans, and he was holding one of those old yellow cameras with a manual dial to advance the film. The man grinned at me as he raised his camera and took another picture. He looked to be in his 40s, scruffy, tall, and a bit gaunt. As he took a step forward, I instinctively stepped back. He turned the camera's dial again, raising it toward me, and I froze completely at a loss for what to do. Just then, my aunt stumbled out of the trees, muttering about how much she missed her teenage years. And she too spotted the man. She stopped mid-sentence staring. The man ignored her, keeping his eyes fixed on me, snapping another picture. Then he did something chilling. He wagged his finger in a no motion, pointed to a knife sheath on his belt, and traced a finger across his throat in a menacing gesture. My body switched to autopilot. I spun around and began sprinting, dragging my aunt along with me. My heart thundered as I ran, hearing another camera click and what sounded like flashing footsteps following behind us. We darted up the slope, my legs feeling like lead. The river was deep in some spots, but here a grown man could wade across easily. Panic setting in, we saw the stairs again and ducked to the other side, taking cover beside each other as we tried to control our breathing. I was gasping so hard, I had to stifle the sound with my hand. But then I heard something that made my skin crawl. The snap of branches, like someone was charging through the undergrowth nearby. I was terrified. The path back to the cabins wasn't straightforward. It wound through the forest full of rocks and dips, forcing us to zigzag and watch our footing. There were so many rocks and roots that it would be easy to trip. I could barely keep myself together. Every mile felt like an eternity, but we had to keep going. About a mile from the cabins, I tripped catching a branch and smacking my head against a tree. I tasted blood, realizing I'd bitten my lip. Dizzy and dazed, I pressed myself against the tree while my aunt rushed back to help me. Whispering urgently, she kept repeating that we had to keep moving. We still had another mile or so to reach my family's property and a few more until we were close to my grandmother's cabin. Though my ears rang and my aunt's frantic pleas barely registered, she kept urging me along. Finally, we broke through the woods, stumbling into my grandmother's yard. I bolt inside, sobbing. My grandma, seeing us bruised and covered in scratches, called for my grandpa, who immediately grabbed his rifle. My aunt told him everything, omitting only her smoking session. Soon, he rallied the men in our family, each armed, and went door to door, warning the rest of our relatives and searching for any trace of the stranger. There was no self-service to call for help, and it would take local law enforcement well over an hour to get up to our secluded location. It was getting dark, and the winding mountain roads were too dangerous to drive after sundown anyway. My mom arrived soon after and dismissed the story, saying that we'd probably just scared ourselves and imagined things, especially since my aunt had been high. But my aunt was adamant, insisting we were telling the truth. They argued until my grandmother stepped in and told them both to calm down. Despite everyone searching the area, no one found any trace of the strange man. That night, for the first time in years, every door on the mountain was locked. To this day, I sometimes wonder if I ended up as part of someone's disturbing photo collection. But knowing what might have happened if I'd been alone, I think I can live with that unsettling thought.